before you make a decision that will irrevocably alter the course of your life. Do you know who I am?
Do I know who you are? Let me guess. You're the mayor?
The day was born in shades of gray and cool blue, a quiet dawn breaking over Boston's Beacon Hill. For Judge Arthur Hayes, this was the hour of stillness, a sacred pocket of time before the world awoke and remembered its arguments, its grievances, and its demands. Saturday mornings were his sanctuary. His ritual was as unchanging as the worn cobblestones under his feet. Up before sunrise, a single cup of black coffee, and then a long, meandering walk through the labyrinthine streets that had witnessed centuries of American history unfold. He wore a simple gray sweatsuit and worn-in running shoes, an anonymous uniform that allowed him to melt into the city's early morning shadows. This anonymity was a balm. In the courtroom, he was the Honorable Arthur Hayes, a title that carried the weight of law, precedent, and the lives he influenced. But here, in the pre-dawn quiet, he was just Arthur, a man who found peace in the rhythm of his own footsteps. He loved this neighborhood not for its affluence, but for its permanence. The gas lamps, still flickering with a soft golden light, stood like ancient sentinels. The brick townhouses, with their polished brass knockers and ivy-clad walls, seemed to hold their breath, preserving the stories of generations. He ran a hand along the cold, wrought-iron fence of a small park, the metal slick with morning dew. This walk was a form of meditation, a way to connect with something larger and more enduring than the daily conflicts that passed through his chambers. It was a reminder that the principles of justice he upheld were not abstract concepts, but were woven into the very fabric of the nation, brick by brick, law by law. Each step was a silent conversation with the past, each breath of cool, crisp air a cleansing of the mind. He turned onto Chestnut Street, perhaps the most picturesque of all. The narrow lane was quiet, save for the distant hum of a street sweeper and the gentle rustle of leaves in the ancient elms. A light came on in a window above, a brief silhouette of someone starting their day, and then it was gone. He felt a sense of belonging here, a quiet kinship with the sleeping city. This was his home. He had worked tirelessly to earn his place in it, not just in this neighborhood, but in the hallowed halls of the federal judiciary. The journey had been long, fraught with obstacles others could not imagine, but it had forged in him a profound sense of calm, a deliberate composure that was often mistaken for detachment. It was, in truth, a shield. He paused, stretching his legs, and looked up at the sky. The first hints of pink and orange were beginning to bleed into the horizon. In a few hours, he would be poring over briefs for a complex corporate espionage case, dissecting arguments, weighing evidence. But now, his mind was clear. His thoughts were his own. There was no plaintiff, no defendant, only the quiet dialogue between a man and his city. He cherished these moments, these stolen hours of simplicity. They were the anchor that held him steady in the often turbulent waters of his profession. He took a deep, satisfying breath, the air clean and cold, and prepared to continue his loop, a route he had walked 1,000 times before. It was a path of peace, a predictable and comforting thread in the tapestry of his life. He had no reason to believe that this morning would be any different from all the others. He had no idea that a different kind of order, one based not on law but on prejudice, was about to intersect his well-trodden path. The sound was subtle at first, a low thrum that was slightly out of place with the morning symphony. It wasn't the municipal hum of the street sweeper or the growl of a garbage truck. This was a smoother, more patient sound, a predator's purr. A police cruiser, stark white and blue against the historic red brick, turned the corner from Charles Street, its tires whispering over the cobblestones. It moved at a speed that was unnaturally slow, a crawl that was less about patrolling and more about scanning. Judge Hayes registered its presence with the practiced awareness of every black man in America, a subconscious check of his own posture, his pace, his hands. He did nothing to alter his behavior. He was simply a man walking, There was no reason to be alarmed. But the car did not pass. Instead, it matched his pace, maintaining a fixed distance of about 30 feet behind him. The engine's low hum was now a constant companion, a dissonant note in the morning's quiet harmony. He could feel the unseen driver's attention fixed on him, a palpable weight on the back of his neck. He resisted the urge to look back, to acknowledge the surveillance. To do so would be to concede that something was amiss, to validate the suspicion that was now tailing him like a shadow. He kept his eyes forward, focusing on the intricate patterns of the brick sidewalk, on the way the nascent sunlight caught the edges of the window panes. He tried to hold on to the peace he had felt just moments before, but it was slipping away, replaced by a familiar, weary tension in his shoulders. The cruiser stayed with him for the length of the block. As he approached the next corner, he thought, "This is where it passes. It will turn, or it will accelerate and continue on its way." It was a test of reason against a growing sense of unease. But when he turned right onto a narrower, more secluded side street, the cruiser turned with him. The low hum of the engine was now amplified by the close-set buildings, echoing in the enclosed space. The hunt had become more deliberate. The pretense of a routine patrol was gone. This was personal. Judge Hayes's mind, trained to analyze facts and dismiss speculation, began to race. He cataloged his appearance: a simple sweatsuit, no logos. His actions: walking at a steady, unhurried pace. His location: a residential neighborhood on a Saturday morning. There was no logical predicate for this level of scrutiny. And in that absence of logic, there was only one possible explanation, an old and ugly one he knew all too well. He could feel his heart rate quicken, not with fear, but with a profound and exhausting frustration. He had presided over cases involving police misconduct. He had read the reports, heard the testimony, and seen the devastating aftermath of encounters that began just like this, with a baseless suspicion, a feeling, an assumption. He had always approached these cases with judicial impartiality, but he understood the human cost on a level that his colleagues could not. Now, the abstract legal principles he debated in court were manifesting as a slow-moving vehicle at his back. The hunter's gaze was no longer just a feeling, it was a reality. As the cruiser finally pulled ahead and angled toward the curb just in front of him, its brake lights casting a sudden sharp red glow against the brick walls, he knew his sanctuary had been breached. The quiet walk was over. The interrogation was about to begin. The cruiser's engine cut out, and the sudden silence was more jarring than the sound had been. For a moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then, the driver's side door opened with a deliberate metallic click. The officer who emerged was young, likely in his late 20s, with a physique that spoke of more time in the gym than on the streets. His uniform was crisp, the creases sharp, his badge polished to a high sheen. He didn't slam the door but closed it with a soft thud, a small act that somehow felt more menacing than overt aggression. He stood for a moment, his hand resting near his belt, and simply watched Judge Hayes approach. He made no move to get out of the way, effectively blocking the narrow sidewalk. Arthur stopped about 10 feet away, maintaining a non-threatening distance. He kept his hands visible, away from his pockets, a piece of choreography he had learned long ago. He waited. The opening move was the officer's to make. "Mornin'," the officer said. The word was flat, devoid of warmth. It wasn't a greeting, it was an opening salvo. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, swept over Arthur, from his running shoes to his face, and his expression was a mixture of boredom and disdain. "Good morning, officer," Arthur replied, his voice even and calm. He had learned that his greatest tool in these moments was his own composure. Panic or anger was a currency his opponent would readily accept. Calm was a language they often struggled to understand. "Something I can help you with?" the officer asked, though his tone made it clear he was not offering assistance. The question hung in the air, an implicit accusation. "You don't belong here. Explain yourself." "No, thank you. I'm just out for my morning walk," Arthur said simply. The officer, whose name tag read Riley, tilted his head, a gesture of feigned curiosity. Your morning walk. Right. See any ID on you? It wasn't a question. It was a command wrapped in the thinnest veil of politeness. Arthur's internal shield fortified itself. The legal framework of the encounter was now being established. "Am I being detained, Officer Riley?" he asked, his tone remaining conversational. "Am I not free to go?" He used the officer's name deliberately, a subtle signal that he was paying attention, that he was not an anonymous target. Riley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He hadn't expected the precise language of the law on this quiet street corner. "I'm conducting a field inquiry," he said, the phrase sounding rehearsed. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. A man matching your description." It was a classic textbook lie, so common it was almost cliché. Arthur glanced around the empty, sleeping street. "Suspicious activity? At this hour?" He kept his expression neutral, but a deep weariness settled into his bones. He had heard this script before, from the witness stand, in depositions. It was the all-purpose justification, the key that unlocked the door to baseless stops and searches. "And what description would that be?" "Let's just start with some ID," Riley insisted, taking a half-step forward. The space between them shrank. "Makes things a lot easier for everyone." "I'm afraid I don't carry my wallet when I go for a run," Arthur said, which was the truth. He never did. There was no need. "But again, unless I am being detained for a specific, articulable suspicion of a crime, I'm not legally required to identify myself. That's the law in this state, as I'm sure you know." The reference to the law seemed to irritate Riley more than anything else. His veneer of professional detachment began to crack. The stop was no longer about a non-existent report. It had become a contest of wills, a challenge to his authority on this cobblestone street. The innocence of the morning had been fully interrupted, replaced by a tense, legalistic dance under the cold blue eyes of a man who had already decided who Arthur was. Officer Riley's posture shifted. He squared his shoulders and planted his feet, a subtle transformation from inquiry to confrontation. The architecture of his assumption was being built, not on evidence, but on a foundation of prejudice. His questions were no longer procedural. They were personal, each one a brick in the wall he was constructing around Judge Hayes. "You don't live around here, do you?" Riley stated, less a question than a verdict. His gaze drifted past Arthur to the multi-million-dollar townhouses, then back to Arthur's simple gray sweatsuit. The comparison was implicit and insulting. "I do, in fact," Arthur replied, his voice unwavering. He refused to offer more. He would not play the game of justifying his own existence. He would not list his credentials or his address to appease a patrolman on a power trip. To do so would be to accept the premise of the question, that his presence required justification. Riley let out a short, humorless puff of air. "Right. So what's your address?" "Officer," Arthur said, his patience beginning to fray at the edges, though his voice did not betray it. "We've already established that I'm not required to answer that unless you are detaining me. Have you witnessed me commit a crime? Are you investigating a specific incident in which I am a suspect?" Each question was a precise legal instrument, designed to dismantle the officer's flimsy pretext. Arthur knew the law as well as he knew the lines on his own hand. A police officer could not simply stop and demand information from a citizen based on a hunch or the color of their skin. There had to be reasonable, articulable suspicion. Riley had articulated nothing. The officer's face flushed with a dull, angry red. He was being challenged on his own turf, and he didn't like it. His training had likely prepared him for shouting, for fear, for flight. It had not prepared him for a calm, articulate man who knew his rights better than Riley knew his own regulations. "Look, pal," Riley said, his tone dropping the last pretense of professionalism. "It's real simple. People in this neighborhood, they get nervous when they see someone who doesn't fit. You understand what I'm saying?" Someone who doesn't fit. The words hung in the cool morning air. It was the quiet, coded language of racial profiling, the polite veneer over an ugly truth. Riley wasn't just an officer, he was a gatekeeper, and he had judged Arthur to be an intruder. "The only person who seems nervous here is you, officer," Arthur said, his gaze steady and direct. "I fit just fine. I'm a resident, a taxpayer, and a citizen out for a walk. The same as the man who just peered out of that window, and the woman who will be out walking her dog in about 10 minutes. The only difference between me and them, it seems, is the one you've constructed in your head." The reference to the window watcher made Riley's eyes dart around for a second. He hadn't realized they might have an audience. For a moment, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed stubbornness. He couldn't back down now. His authority had been questioned. To walk away would be to admit defeat. The assumption he had built was now a prison for him as much as it was for Arthur. He had to prove his initial judgment was correct. He had to find a reason, any reason, to validate the stop. The encounter was no longer about public safety. It was about an officer's ego. And that, Arthur knew, was the most dangerous territory of all. The confrontation had settled into a tense stalemate, a standoff of words and wills on the quiet residential street. But they were not alone. The subtle signs of an awakening neighborhood were becoming more apparent, and with them, the silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. A sheer white curtain in a second-story window across the street twitched, then fell back into place. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but both men knew what it meant. Someone was watching. A few doors down, an elderly man in a bathrobe who had stepped out to retrieve his morning paper from the stoop paused. He stood, paper in hand, his gaze fixed on the two figures by the police cruiser. He didn't stare overtly, but held his position longer than necessary, his curiosity overriding his morning routine. The silent judgment of the neighborhood was beginning to gather. Officer Riley, though trying to project an aura of unshakable control, was clearly aware of the growing audience. His focus, which had been intensely locked on Arthur, began to waver. His eyes flicked from Arthur to the windows, to the man with the newspaper, then back again. This was not how he had envisioned the encounter. It was supposed to be a quick, clean assertion of dominance, a few probing questions, a demand for ID, and the satisfaction of watching the man in the sweatsuit retreat, properly chastened and reminded of his place. Instead, it had devolved into a public legal debate, and he was on the losing side. The presence of onlookers changed the dynamic entirely. It was no longer his word against a suspect's. It was a performance with a jury. Arthur, too, was acutely aware of the eyes on them. For him, it was a double-edged sword. On one hand, witnesses could be a deterrent against further escalation. An officer might think twice about becoming physical if he knew he was being observed. On the other hand, it was a profound humiliation. He was a respected member of this community, a federal judge, being treated like a common criminal on the streets of his own neighborhood. His privacy was being stripped away, his dignity eroded with every passing second. He could feel the imagined whispers, the questions that would be asked later. "Did you see what happened this morning? There was a police officer talking to that black man who walks so early." The sound of a heavy oak door opening and closing nearby drew both their gazes. A woman in expensive athletic wear, holding the leashes of two impeccably groomed golden retrievers, emerged from a townhouse. She stopped dead when she saw the scene, her bright, morning-ready smile faltering. The dogs, sensing her tension, let out a low, guttural growl. She pulled them back, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and intrigue. She knew Arthur. Not personally, but she recognized him from the neighborhood, the quiet, distinguished man who always gave a polite nod. To see him in a confrontation with the police was a dissonance she couldn't immediately process. She fumbled for her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen. Riley saw the phone. The sight of it seemed to ignite a fresh spark of anger in him. The encounter was now at risk of being documented, of escaping his control and living forever in the digital world. His narrative could be challenged, his actions scrutinized. The pressure was mounting. He had to end this, and he had to win. The curtain twitch had become a potential viral video, and the silent audience had become a circle of potential witnesses against him. The quiet street corner had transformed into a stage, and his next act, born of frustration and pride, would be a reckless and irreversible escalation. The sight of the woman with the phone was the tipping point for Officer Riley. His frustration, simmering for the past few minutes, boiled over into a raw and reckless display of authority. The pretense of investigation evaporated, replaced by the blunt instrument of command. He was no longer trying to win a legal argument. He was going to end it by force. "That's it. I've had enough of your games," Riley snapped, his voice hard and sharp. He took another deliberate step forward, closing the remaining distance until he was towering over Arthur. The smell of stale coffee and mint gum emanated from him. "Turn around. Put your hands on the car." The order was so flagrantly illegal, so devoid of any legal justification, that for a moment, Arthur was stunned into silence. There had been no crime. There was no weapon. There was no threat. The command was built on nothing but the officer's own wounded ego. It was an order built on sand, and yet it carried the potential force of a hurricane. "On what grounds, officer?" Arthur asked, his voice low and steady, though his heart was now pounding against his ribs. This was the precipice. The moment an encounter could spiral violently out of control. "You cannot search me without probable cause, and you certainly cannot order me to assume that position without a lawful reason for arrest." "My lawful reason is failure to cooperate with a police investigation," Riley shot back, his eyes blazing. "It's not a crime to refuse to cooperate with a voluntary encounter," Arthur countered, the words coming automatically from years of legal practice. "You have manufactured an investigation out of thin air. That is not how the Constitution works." The word Constitution seemed to be a lit fuse. To Riley, it was not a sacred document, but a frustrating obstacle, a bit of esoteric jargon that people like this use to escape consequences. He saw it as a trick. "I'm the one with the badge and the gun," Riley said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. His hand moved from his belt and rested pointedly on the butt of his sidearm. It wasn't a draw, but it was a clear and unambiguous threat. "And I'm telling you what's going to happen. You can either turn around and put your hands on my car, or I'm going to put you on the ground and do it for you. Your choice." The street fell into an even deeper silence. The man with the newspaper had frozen mid-step. The woman with the dogs had taken an involuntary step backward, pulling her pets close. The curtain across the street was now pulled fully aside, revealing the pale, shocked face of a woman holding a coffee mug. They were all witnesses to a flagrant abuse of power, a raw, naked threat delivered in the light of day. Arthur stood his ground. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations. To comply would be to surrender his rights and validate the officer's illegal actions. To refuse could lead to violence, to injury, to an arrest that would be a professional and personal nightmare, even if the charges were ultimately dropped. He looked at Riley's face, at the anger and insecurity warring in his eyes, and he saw a man who had backed himself into a corner. A man who was now too proud and too stubborn to de-escalate. There was no path forward with logic or law. Riley had abandoned both. He had to find a different path, a third option. He had held it in reserve, a card he never wanted to play because using it felt like an admission that the system was broken, that his rights as a citizen were not enough. But his rights as a citizen were clearly not being honored. He had one last tool at his disposal, not to win the argument, but to end it. He took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to deploy it. The air between the two men was electric with unspoken violence. Officer Riley's hand remained on his weapon, a silent promise of what was to come. The onlookers stood like statues, frozen in a tableau of disbelief. Judge Hayes knew he had only seconds before the officer's threat became action. The path of reason was closed. The path of compliance was a surrender to injustice. He had to forge a new one. He let out the breath he was holding, a slow, steady exhalation that seemed to draw all the tension from his body. His posture, which had been defensively rigid, relaxed. He lowered his gaze from Riley's eyes for a fraction of a second, then met them again, not with defiance, but with a profound, almost weary calm. It was the calm of a man who had seen the bottom of the deck and knew exactly which card he was about to play. "Officer," he began, and his voice had changed. The conversational, questioning tone was gone. In its place was a quiet, resonant authority, the same voice he used in his courtroom just before delivering a judgment. It was a voice that did not invite debate. It commanded attention. "Before you make a decision that will irrevocably alter the course of your life," he said, the words precise and measured, "I'm going to ask you a question." Riley's expression was one of contemptuous impatience. He clearly expected a plea or a final, desperate legal argument. He shifted his weight, preparing to move. Arthur held up a single hand, a simple gesture to halt, and for a reason he probably couldn't explain, Riley paused. "Do you know who I am?" The question was not born of arrogance or of a threat. It was forged in the cold fire of necessity, tempered by years of quiet dignity and immense responsibility. It was a question forged in steel. It landed in the space between them with an incredible weight, heavier than any physical blow. It was simple, direct, and utterly unexpected. It changed the entire framework of the encounter. The question was not, "What have I done?" but "What are you doing?" It was a final, desperate lifeline thrown to a man who was drowning in his own prejudice and pride. For a moment, the question seemed to hang in the air, shimmering with all its implications. It was a gamble. It could be interpreted as a threat, further enraging the already unstable officer. But Arthur had judged his man. He saw past the bluster to the deep-seated insecurity beneath. An insecure man in a position of power is obsessed with hierarchy, with who is above and who is below him. Arthur's question was a direct challenge to that hierarchy, a suggestion that the officer's entire understanding of the situation, of his own place in it, might be catastrophically wrong. The residents watching from their windows and doorways couldn't hear the softly spoken words, but they saw the shift. They saw the officer freeze, his forward momentum completely arrested by 6 simple words. They saw the flicker of confusion in his eyes, the first crack in his armor of aggressive certainty. The air crackled, not with the threat of violence, but with the dawning of a terrible and significant new reality. The game had changed, and the next move was Officer Riley's. His response would seal his fate. The moment stretched, taut, and silent. Judge Hayes's question echoed in the confined space of the street, a quiet challenge that demanded a response. Officer Riley's mind seemed to process the query through a filter of pure contempt. He didn't hear it as a warning, he heard it as a bluff, the last pathetic gambit of a cornered man trying to invent importance. A slow, condescending smile spread across his lips, and then it happened. He laughed. It was not a sound of mirth or amusement. It was a sharp, derisive burst of sound, short and ugly. It was the laugh of a bully who believes he has just heard the most ridiculous lie imaginable. The sound cut through the morning quiet, a declaration of his own supreme confidence and his target's absolute insignificance. "Do I know who you are?" Riley repeated, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "Let me guess. You're the mayor? The police commissioner? No, wait, I got it." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, mocking whisper. "You're Barack Obama's secret brother, right? Here to check up on things." The insult, so juvenile and steeped in racial undertones, was a clear window into Riley's mind. To him, the idea that this man, this black man in a simple sweatsuit who dared to question him, could be a person of any consequence was not just unlikely, it was laughable. It was an impossibility that violated his entire worldview. His arrogance was a shield, protecting him from the frightening possibility that he had made a terrible mistake. As long as he could mock, he could maintain control. "I see," Arthur said, his expression unreadable. The laugh had not angered him. It had saddened him. It was the sound of a mind so closed, so steeped in its own biases, that it could no longer recognize reality, even when it was standing right in front of it. "So you're choosing not to know?" "Oh, I know exactly who you are," Riley shot back, his bravado surging. You're a guy who doesn't belong in this neighborhood, who got caught, and who's trying to talk his way out of it by making up some fantasy story. I see it all the time. It's not gonna work." He straightened up, his brief moment of humor evaporating, replaced by a renewed, hardened resolve. The laughter had served its purpose. It had reaffirmed his own superiority in his mind. "It's time to end this," Riley declared, his hand coming off his weapon. He reached instead for the handcuffs clipped to his belt. The metallic click as he unsnapped them was loud and final in the still air. "I gave you a choice. You made the wrong one. Hands on the car. Now, or I will charge you with resisting arrest on top of everything else." Everything else? Arthur thought. There was nothing. There was only this officer's towering, unshakable arrogance. He had offered a way out, a chance for de-escalation, and it had been met with laughter and contempt. The officer had closed the final door himself. Now there was no choice left but to present the proof. The time for questions was over. It was time for the answer. The arrogance of power was about to collide with the quiet, unassailable fact of it. Arthur gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not to the officer but to himself. So be it. With the threat of cold steel now imminent, Judge Hayes made no sudden moves. Every motion was deliberate, slow, and broadcasted. He knew that reaching for anything at this point could be misinterpreted as reaching for a weapon, giving Officer Riley the very pretext he was so desperately seeking. "Officer," Arthur said, his voice calm and clear, ensuring the onlookers could hear. "I am not resisting. I am going to reach slowly into the front pocket of my sweatshirt. I am going to retrieve my wallet. It is the only thing in that pocket." Riley hesitated, his hand hovering over the handcuffs. The procedure was correct. The man was announcing his actions. To attack him now would be an undeniable act of aggression, especially with witnesses present. "Go ahead," Riley said, his voice tight with suspicion. Slowly. Arthur's hands, which had been held carefully away from his body, moved with a surgeon's steadiness. He slipped 2 fingers into the zippered pocket of his gray sweatshirt. For a moment, he felt nothing but the soft fleece lining, and a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. Had he, in his pre-dawn routine, forgotten it? No. His fingers brushed against the cool, familiar leather. He drew out a slim, black card holder, nothing more than 2 pieces of leather stitched together, holding only the essentials for his morning walks. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, showing it to the officer before making any move to open it. The wallet itself was unremarkable, worn at the corners from years of use. But what it contained was not. Arthur slowly, carefully, slid 1 card from its sleeve. It was not a driver's license. It was not a credit card. It was a simple white card bearing his name, Arthur M. Hayes, and beneath his name a title, United States District Judge. But it was the emblem in the corner that held all the power, the Great Seal of the United States, embossed in brilliant, unmistakable gold. The American eagle, clutching an olive branch and arrows, seemed to glitter in the early morning light. He didn't hand it to Riley. He simply held it in the palm of his hand, angled so the officer could clearly read the text and see the seal. He said nothing. The card spoke for itself, a silent, irrefutable testament to the truth. It was a small, light object, a few grams of paper and ink and foil. But in that moment, it carried the full, crushing weight of the United States federal judiciary. It represented the very system of laws that Officer Riley had, for the past 10 minutes, so casually and contemptuously disregarded. The weight of that single card was about to bring the officer's entire world crashing down. Riley squinted, his eyes still clouded with disbelief. He took a half-step closer, leaning in to read the small print. Arthur held his hand perfectly still, a silent statue of judgment. He watched the officer's eyes trace the words. He saw the flicker of recognition, the dawning confusion, the desperate internal struggle to deny what was plainly before him. The laugh lines around Riley's eyes vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed, blank expression. The card was not a bluff. It was a fact. And that fact was a mirror, forcing Officer Riley to see the abyss that had just opened up beneath his feet. The change in Officer Riley was not gradual. It was a sudden, catastrophic collapse. One moment he was the picture of arrogant authority. The next he was a man hollowed out by a revelation he could not process. His eyes, locked on the golden seal of the credential, widened until the whites were visible all around the pale blue irises. The condescending smirk that had been fixed on his face didn't just fade, it fell, his jaw going slack as if a crucial muscle had been severed. The blood drained from his face, leaving behind a pallid, almost greenish-gray mask of shock. He took a single, involuntary step backward, a physical retreat from the horrifying truth in front of him. His hand, which had been ready to dispense handcuffs, fell limp at his side. The handcuffs themselves seemed to suddenly weigh 1,000 pounds. The world, which moments before had been a stage for his dominance, seemed to dissolve around him. The sounds of the city, the distant traffic, the chirping of a bird, the rustle of leaves, faded into a dull, roaring vacuum. All that existed was the white card, the golden eagle, and the calm, unwavering eyes of the man holding it. The title echoed in his mind, each word a hammer blow against the fragile architecture of his assumptions. United States. District. Judge. He had not just stopped a citizen without cause. He had not just illegally ordered a man to submit to a search. He had not just threatened to use force. He had done all of this to a sitting federal judge. A man who held the power to preside over cases involving the very department that employed him. A man who could, with the stroke of a pen, alter the course of lives and institutions. A man who was a living embodiment of the constitutional law Riley had just treated with such derision. The phrase he had sneered just minutes earlier, "I'm the one with the badge and the gun," now sounded like the pathetic boast of a fool. A wave of cold sweat broke out on his forehead. His breathing, which had been steady and controlled, became shallow and ragged. He tried to speak, to form a word, an apology, a question, a denial, but his throat had closed up. No sound came out. The silence that enveloped them was no longer tense. It was deafening. It was the sound of a career ending. It was the sound of a lawsuit being born. It was the sound of a man plummeting from a great height with nothing but the long, terrifying fall to contemplate his mistake. Judge Hayes slowly withdrew his hand and slipped the card back into his wallet. He did not look triumphant. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly tired. He had won, but it was a victory he had never wanted. He had been forced to use the shield of his office when the shield of his citizenship should have been enough. He looked at the young, broken officer before him. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a tectonic plate. Riley was no longer the hunter. He was the prey, caught in the inescapable trap of his own actions. And in the deafening, horrifying silence, all he could do was wait for the judgment he knew was to come. Into the profound silence, a new sound emerged. It was the crunch of tires on a side street, followed by the familiar professional tone of a police radio. A second cruiser, this one a sergeant's vehicle, pulled up quietly behind Officer Riley's car. It parked without haste, its arrival lacking the aggressive posture of the first. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and streaks of gray in her tightly bound hair. Her name tag read Rostova, and she wore the 3 chevrons of a sergeant on her sleeve. She carried herself with an air of settled, seen-it-all competence. Sergeant Ava Rostova's gaze swept the scene with an efficiency born of 2 decades on the force. She took in everything in a single, comprehensive glance. Her junior officer, Nolan Riley, standing frozen and pale as a ghost. The distinguished black man in the gray sweatsuit, whose posture radiated an unnerving calm. The small but significant audience of residents watching from windows and doorways, some with phones still in hand. She immediately recognized the tableau for what it was, a public relations disaster in the making. Her expression, initially neutral, hardened with concern. She began walking toward them, her steps measured and purposeful. "Riley," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge of command. "What's the situation here?" Riley flinched at the sound of her voice, as if woken from a trance. He turned to face her, his face a mess of panic and confusion. "Sarge, I was just—" he stammered, his usual cocksure demeanor completely shattered. He looked from Rostova back to Judge Hayes, as if hoping one of them would explain the catastrophe he had created. But Sergeant Rostova's attention had already shifted. Her experienced eyes fell on Judge Hayes. She didn't know him personally, but she was a career officer who worked out of the downtown precinct. She had been to the federal courthouse for meetings, for testimony. She had seen the portraits of the judges hanging in the halls. And though he was dressed in simple workout clothes, there was something undeniably familiar about the man's face, his dignified bearing. A cold seed of dread began to sprout in her stomach. She stopped a respectful distance away and addressed Arthur directly, her tone shifting from the clipped command she used with Riley to one of professional courtesy. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Rostova. Is there a problem here?" Before Arthur could answer, Riley, in a desperate attempt to justify himself, blurted out, "He wouldn't show me any ID, Sarge. He was being uncooperative." Rostova shot Riley a look that could have frozen water. "I was speaking to this gentleman, officer," she said, her voice dropping a degree in temperature. She turned back to Arthur, her eyes now searching his face with dawning recognition. "There is no problem now, Sergeant," Judge Hayes said, his voice calm and even. "But there was one. Your officer here felt my presence in this neighborhood constituted suspicious activity." Rostova's face paled slightly as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She knew exactly who he was now. The man from the portraits. The judge who had presided over the landmark consent decree case against the neighboring police department last year. Federal Judge Arthur Hayes. Her dread blossomed into full-blown horror. She had not just walked into a complaint, she had walked into a federal incident. The arrival of experience had just collided with the aftermath of reckless ignorance, and her only job now was to try and contain the nuclear fallout. Sergeant Rostova's entire demeanor transformed. The professional courtesy she had shown a moment before solidified into a profound, almost deferential respect. The change was so immediate and so absolute that it seemed to suck the remaining air from the street. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and firm, the title ringing with official gravity. "I am so sorry. I am Sergeant Eva Rostova. Are you all right? Have you been injured?" The words, "Your Honor," struck Officer Riley like a physical blow. He visibly recoiled, a small, choked sound escaping his lips. If he had harbored any last, desperate shred of doubt, it was now utterly extinguished. The confirmation, coming from his own superior officer, was final. He had threatened and attempted to illegally detain a federal judge. Judge Hayes gave a slight nod to the sergeant. "I am not physically injured, Sergeant Rostova. Thank you for your concern." His calm was more damning than any tirade could have been. Rostova turned her head slowly, her eyes fixing on Riley. The look she gave him was one of pure, unadulterated fury, contained within a mask of cold, professional control. All the years of her experience, all her frustration with young, arrogant officers who created messes she had to clean up, coalesced into this single, searing glare. "Officer Riley," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Did you activate your body camera when you initiated this stop?" Yes, Sarge, I did," Riley whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do not turn it off," she commanded. "Every second of this interaction from this point forward will be on the record. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Sergeant." "You will stand over there," she pointed to the sidewalk by the passenger side of his cruiser. "You will not speak to anyone. You will not touch your radio. You will not use your phone. You will wait for my instructions. Is that clear?" "Crystal clear, Sergeant," he mumbled, his eyes cast down to the cobblestones. He shuffled away like a chastened child, his entire posture one of defeat. The bully, stripped of his authority and publicly rebuked by his superior, had been completely and systematically dismantled. Rostova watched him for a second to ensure compliance before turning back to Judge Hayes. Your Honor, on behalf of my department, I offer you our most profound apologies for the conduct of this officer. His actions were unprofessional, unjustified, and will be subject to an immediate and thorough internal investigation. I appreciate that, Sergeant, Arthur said. But I believe this situation may have moved beyond an internal matter. Rostova nodded, her expression grim. She knew he was right. Yes, sir, I understand completely. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The chain of command needed to be notified. The chief, the city's legal department. This was no longer a simple disciplinary issue. This was a crisis. Your officer, Judge Hayes continued, his gaze shifting to the retreating form of Riley, made a number of statements. He seemed to believe that someone like me doesn't become a person of your stature. He let the sentence hang in the air, allowing its full, ugly weight to be felt. Sergeant Rostova closed her eyes for a brief moment, a flicker of pain and exhaustion crossing her face. The one thing she had feared was true. It wasn't just a bad stop, it was a stop motivated by explicit bias. That, Your Honor, she said, opening her eyes again, is something that will be addressed at the highest level. I promise you that. With the immediate situation stabilized and Officer Riley neutralized, Sergeant Rostova's focus shifted to the second, equally critical phase, securing the evidence. She knew that in the hours and days to come, every second of this encounter would be scrutinized, analyzed, and debated by internal affairs, by city attorneys, and very likely by federal investigators. The primary irrefutable witness was not human. It was the small black lens pinned to the center of Riley's chest. "Riley!" Rostova called out, her voice sharp, cutting through his stunned paralysis. He looked up, his eyes wide and vacant. "Approach me, slowly." He obeyed, his movements stiff and robotic. He walked toward her as if wading through deep water, stopping a few feet away. He kept his gaze averted, focusing on a point somewhere over her shoulder. "Officer Nolan Riley, badge number 734, Rostova said, speaking with formal precision, ensuring her words were being clearly recorded by both her own and Riley's body cameras. "Pursuant to departmental policy regarding incidents that may result in civil or criminal liability, I am ordering you to deactivate your body-worn camera. You will then immediately surrender the device to me." Riley's hand trembled as he reached for the button on his chest. He fumbled with it for a moment, his fingers clumsy. Finally, a small beep signaled the camera was off. The unblinking red light, which had silently chronicled his professional self-destruction, went dark. "Hand it over," Rostova commanded, holding out her hand. He unclipped the device from its magnetic mount and placed it in her outstretched palm. The transfer felt like a formal surrender. As soon as the camera was in her possession, Rostova pulled a sealed evidence bag from her cargo pocket, her movements practiced and efficient. She placed the camera inside, tore off the adhesive strip, and folded it over, creating a tamper-proof seal. She then took a pen from her shirt pocket and began meticulously filling out the chain of custody label on the bag. Date, time, incident number, officer's name, her own name, and badge number. Judge Hayes watched the procedure with a practiced eye. He had seen this ritual countless times in court. He knew its importance. That small plastic bag now contained the objective truth of the matter. It held Riley's tone of voice, his derisive laughter, his illegal orders, his threats. It held Arthur's own calm, his legally precise questions, and the final, quiet query that had changed everything. The camera, which Riley had likely viewed as a tool to protect himself and intimidate suspects, had become the primary instrument of his own undoing. Its memory was perfect, its testimony unbiased. "This device will be logged into evidence at the precinct, Your Honor," Rostova explained, her voice underscoring the formality of the process. "A copy of the footage will be made available to the appropriate investigative bodies. There will be no gaps, no edits." "I would expect nothing less, Sergeant," Arthur replied. Rostova gave a final sharp nod. The crucial piece of evidence was secure. The silent, unblinking eye had done its job. Now, the human systems of justice, or of damage control, would take over. She keyed the microphone on her shoulder. "Sergeant Rostova to dispatch," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "Requesting a patrol supervisor to my location, Chestnut Street, immediately." The gears of the official response were beginning to turn, set in motion by the damning digital ghost that now rested in an evidence bag in her hand. Within 48 hours, the digital ghost in the evidence bag had been given a voice. The body camera footage was reviewed by a select few at the highest levels of the Boston Police Department and the mayor's office. The 14 minutes of audio and video were even more damning than Sergeant Rostova's initial report had suggested. The contempt in Officer Riley's voice, the undisguised racial animus in his "someone who doesn't fit" comment, and the derisive, dismissive laugh were irrefutable. The incident could not be spun, minimized, or explained away. It was a textbook case of profiling and abuse of power. An internal affairs investigation was launched with unprecedented speed, and what it began to uncover was not a story of one good officer having a single bad day. It was the story of a system that had ignored a succession of bright red flags. Officer Nolan Riley's file was thick for a man with only 4 years on the force. It revealed a pattern. In his first 2 years, he had accumulated more civilian complaints than any other officer in his graduating class. The complaints were eerily similar. Unwarranted traffic stops in predominantly minority neighborhoods, an aggressive and demeaning tone during street encounters, and a tendency to escalate minor situations. In each case, Riley's narrative in the official report was the same. The citizen was uncooperative, argumentative, or acting suspiciously. And in each case, without video evidence to the contrary, his version of events was accepted by his supervisors, and the complaints were dismissed as unfounded. Digging deeper, investigators found 3 separate pretextual stop cases that had been flagged by the department's own internal risk management unit. These were stops where Riley had used a minor traffic violation, like failing to signal a lane change 100 feet before the turn, as a pretext to question and scrutinize drivers of color. The unit had recommended retraining and closer supervision. Records showed the retraining was a 4-hour online course he completed in 45 minutes, and the closer supervision consisted of his direct sergeant signing off on his reports without comment. The most damning discovery came from his academy evaluations. His psychological screening had raised concerns. A clinical psychologist had noted that Cadet Riley displayed low empathy indicators and a rigid worldview that may lead to difficulty in de-escalating ambiguous social encounters. The report also flagged a subconscious in-group/out-group bias that required monitoring. Yet, he had been passed through, his strong physical performance and marksmanship scores seemingly outweighing the quiet warnings of a mental health professional. His uncle, a retired BPD captain, had apparently made a few calls, smoothing the path and dismissing the psych evaluation as New Age nonsense. Sergeant Rostova, interviewed as part of the investigation, gave a stark assessment. "Riley is a classic bully," she stated, her words recorded for the official record. "He's insecure and he compensates with aggression. He targets people he perceives as weak or powerless, people he thinks won't fight back or won't be believed. He never pulled this stuff with a lawyer from downtown or a businessman in a suit. He went after kids on the corner and guys in sweatsuits. This time he just picked the wrong guy." The history was all there, laid out in black and white. It wasn't a secret. It was a collection of ignored warnings, of minimized complaints, of a culture that had prioritized protecting one of its own over listening to the community it was sworn to serve. Officer Riley wasn't a bad apple. He was the predictable fruit of a poisoned tree. On Monday morning, Judge Hayes was in his chambers, preparing for the week's docket. He was trying to immerse himself in the familiar world of legal briefs and judicial precedent, but the events of Saturday morning felt like a persistent, low-grade fever. He had said nothing to his staff or his clerks. but he knew it was only a matter of time before the story broke. His private line, a number known to only a select few, rang. The caller ID showed it was from the office of the chief of police. Arthur let it ring twice before answering. "Judge Hayes speaking?" The voice on the other end was strained, heavy with the weight of a crisis. "Your Honor, this is Chief Patterson. I am calling to offer you my most sincere and profound apology, not just personally, but on behalf of the entire Boston Police Department." Arthur listened, his expression impassive. He swiveled in his chair to look out the large window overlooking the city. "I appreciate the call, Chief." "What you experienced was inexcusable," Patterson continued, his voice earnest. "It violates every principle of fair and impartial policing that we strive to uphold. I want to assure you that Officer Riley has been suspended without pay, and I have initiated termination proceedings. There is no place for that kind of conduct in my department." The chief went on, detailing the steps of the investigation, promising transparency and vowing departmental reform. He spoke of new training modules on implicit bias and de-escalation. He mentioned a full review of the citizen complaint process. It was the right speech, containing all the right words. Arthur had heard versions of it many times before. "Chief Patterson," Arthur interjected gently when the man finally paused for breath, "let me ask you a question. What would have happened if I were not a federal judge?" The question hung in the air between them, transmitted across the city by a silent, invisible signal. "What if I had been a plumber, a teacher, a student?" Arthur continued, his voice quiet but insistent. "What if I had been a man with a prior record, a man who fit Officer Riley's narrative of someone who doesn't fit? Would you be calling me now? Or would I be another dismissed complaint? Would I be facing charges of resisting arrest right now, my life turned upside down by the word of one of your officers against mine?" The chief was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, the corporate polish was gone from his voice, replaced by a note of genuine weariness. "No, Your Honor," he said quietly. "Probably not. And that is the problem I have to fix." "Yes, it is," Arthur agreed. He accepted the chief's apology, thanked him for the call, and hung up. He looked out the window at the sprawling city below, at the thousands of lives unfolding in the buildings and on the streets. He felt a deep, abiding sadness. The apology, as sincere as it may have been, could not mend the fundamental breach of trust. It could not erase the humiliation. And it could not answer the question that now haunted him. How many others were out there? How many men and women had faced their own Officer Riley on a quiet street, armed not with a judicial credential, but only with the simple, fragile truth of their own innocence? The system had worked for him because of his title, but a system that only provides justice to the powerful is not a just system at all. The following Saturday, Judge Hayes woke at the same early hour. The ritual was too deeply ingrained to abandon. He put on the same gray sweatsuit, the same worn running shoes. For a moment he hesitated. The thought of walking that same route felt different now, tinged with the memory of the confrontation. His sanctuary had been violated, but to change his routine, to avoid those streets, felt like a concession. It would be allowing Officer Riley's prejudice to dictate his life, to shrink his world. And that, he decided, was a victory he would not grant. He stepped out into the cool, pre-dawn air. The cobblestone streets were just as he remembered, silent and waiting for the sun. But he was not the same. He was more aware, his senses heightened. Every distant sound, every flicker of a light in a window registered with a new significance. He walked with the same steady pace, his posture the same, but the internal peace he had always found on these walks was elusive. It had been replaced by a vigilant awareness, a shield he could not lower. As he turned onto Chestnut Street, the place where it had all happened, he saw that something had changed. The woman with the 2 golden retrievers was just leaving her house. She saw him, and her face broke into a warm, genuine smile. She raised a hand and waved. An elderly man across the street, the one who had been getting his paper, was watering the plants in his window box. He looked down, caught Arthur's eye, and gave a firm, respectful nod. It wasn't pity, it was acknowledgement. It was solidarity. He realized the story had spread through the quiet, grapevine telegraph of the neighborhood. They knew. They had been his silent witnesses, and now they were offering a silent, shared judgment of what had occurred. He had not been just an anonymous man being harassed, he had been their neighbor. The thought brought a small measure of comfort, a faint glimmer of the peace he had lost. He completed his walk, the sense of community a quiet counterpoint to the memory of the conflict. The sanctuary was damaged, but perhaps not broken forever. The official repercussions for Nolan Riley were swift and severe. Faced with the irrefutable body camera footage and a federal civil rights lawsuit, he was fired from the department. The U.S. Attorney's Office, in a move that sent shockwaves through the city, opened a criminal investigation into the pattern of his stops, charging him with color of law violations. His career was over, his future uncertain. But for Judge Hayes, the outcome was secondary. The real fight was not with one man, but with the mindset that had created him. He resumed his walk home, the sun now fully risen, casting long shadows down the narrow streets. The city was waking up, and soon he would have to be Judge Hayes again. But for these last few moments, he was just Arthur, a man walking through his neighborhood, contemplating the intricate, often unseen battles that are fought every day on the quiet streets of America. Justice, he knew, was not just something delivered from a bench in a black robe. Sometimes it was simply the act of walking freely in the morning sun, of claiming your space in the world, of refusing to be moved. The incident on Chestnut Street was more than just a confrontation. It was a symptom of a deeper pathology. To understand Officer Riley's actions, one must look beyond simple malice. His behavior was likely rooted in a complex cocktail of insecurity, tribalism, and a profound lack of perspective. He was a young man given a badge and a gun, tools of immense power, without the commensurate wisdom or empathy to wield them justly. His world was likely a binary one, divided into us and them, where his role was not to protect a diverse community, but to police an alien territory, defending the in-group from perceived threats. When faced with Judge Hayes, a black man who was calm, articulate, and unintimidated, Riley's entire framework short-circuited. The judge's refusal to be categorized as a threat was a direct challenge to the officer's worldview, and his only recourse was to escalate, to force compliance, and thereby validate his initial prejudice. His laugh was not just mockery, it was a desperate defense mechanism against a reality his mind refused to accept. Looking back, one might ask what Judge Hayes could have done differently. If he had immediately announced his title, the confrontation would have ended before it began. But that would have been a personal solution, not a just one. It would have reinforced the idea that rights are dependent on status. If he had carried his ID and simply produced it, he would have complied with a demand that was, at its core, illegitimate. His decision to navigate the situation first as a citizen, asserting his fundamental rights, was a courageous one. It exposed the rot in the system. Perhaps the only true protection in these moments is the presence of witnesses and the unblinking eye of a camera, turning a private humiliation into a public accounting. True safety lies not in credentials, but in transparency. The core message of this story is a quiet but powerful one. Authority without accountability is tyranny. The badge, the uniform, the title, these are not symbols of inherent superiority, but instruments of public trust. When that trust is broken by prejudice, the damage extends far beyond a single incident. It erodes the very foundation of a civil society. Justice demands that we see every individual not for the category we place them in, but for the shared humanity that binds us all. It is the quiet, daily refusal to succumb to suspicion and fear that truly protects and serves a community. What did you feel when the officer laughed? Have you ever witnessed a situation where you felt someone was being judged unfairly before a single word was spoken? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please consider supporting the channel.